Welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is on how to optimize your fat loss phase. More specifically, how we can maximize fat loss while retaining all of our muscle and keeping energy nice and high so you're able to not only enjoy the process, but finish your fat loss phase in a great spot. So, first, we'll touch on what actually is energy balance and metabolism, then, how to set up your fat loss diet, training for fat loss, how sleep and stress play a role in fat loss, and then towards the end, a few supplements that actually work to enhance your fat loss outcomes. Starting with the foundation of fat loss, energy balance and metabolism. You've probably heard the phrase, a calorie deficit is all that matters for fat loss. And while that's technically true, it's also kind of incomplete. Fat loss isn't just about eating less and moving more. No, your metabolism is highly adaptive, and factors like stress, gut health, and muscle mass all influence how many calories you burn. So to break this down, we need to look at total daily energy expenditure, otherwise known as TDEE, which is the total number of calories your body burns in a day. The largest portion, about 70% of your daily caloric burn, comes from your basal metabolic rate, otherwise known as your BMR. This is the energy required just to keep you alive. It'll fuel essential functions like breathing, circulation, cell repair, and then the second component is the thermic effect of food, TEF, which accounts for about 10% of your daily caloric burn. And this is the energy your body expends, digesting, absorbing, and processing nutrients. And protein has the highest thermic effect, meaning it requires more energy to digest and assimilate compared to fats and carbohydrates. And this is one of the reasons why high protein, or at least moderate protein diets, are good for fat loss, because they not only support muscle retention, but also increase your caloric burn without doing any additional activity. Then the final component of your TDEE is activity and exercise, which only accounts for surprisingly about 20% of your total daily energy expenditure. And many people think exercise is the biggest driver of fat loss. But the reality is that your training makes up only a small portion of the calories you burn throughout the day. And then we have non-exercise activity thermogenesis, otherwise known as NEAT. And this is things like walking, fidgeting, standing, bobbing your head, other unconscious movements you do throughout the day that can have a massive impact on fat loss without adding excessive stress or fatigue. Here's where things get a little less black and white from purely energy balance. So when you start your diet, your body undergoes metabolic adaptation, a process where it lowers energy expenditure as a survival mechanism to almost defend against fat loss. And this is why many people experience plateaus or stalls despite maintaining the same caloric deficit that may have worked earlier in their fat loss phase. Now, your body doesn't want to lose fat. It sees calorie restriction as a threat to survival. So as a result, it starts burning fewer calories, reducing your movement unconsciously. So without you realizing it, you're no longer twitching as much or fidgeting. And then we can get into hormones like ghrelin, which will go up to make you feel hungrier because your body wants you to eat. Leptin, your satiety hormone, will go down. And this is why if you decide you want to lose body fat and you start a cut and you just blindly start cutting calories without a strategy or plan, you can absolutely end up losing muscle. You can end up feeling extremely fatigued, feeling sluggish, letting diet fatigue ramp up way too high, and slowing down your metabolism further than what's necessary. You'll see this often with crash diets, which I had my fair share of run-ins with in the past. I'd be 60 pounds overweight and start my diet eating 1,400 calories a day, doing an hour of cardio a day. Long story short, I lost weight but never got to my goal, then rebounded. So now I'm, instead of 60 pounds overweight, I'm 70 pounds overweight, and that cycle went on for a few solid years when I first started. So with that in mind, how do we set up a fat loss diet? Now, what you can do, how most people approach fat loss, is with a vague plan. Cut some calories, do some cardio, eat quote unquote clean, and then just hope for the best. And while for some that may absolutely work, if you're someone who really wants to nail their fat loss phase without a structured approach, you risk losing muscle, crashing your energy levels, or stalling out entirely. So from the start, the goal is to create a calorie deficit that is aggressive enough to drive fat loss, but sustainable enough to maintain performance and muscle mass. So the first step is determining the right caloric deficit. And a good starting point is to reduce your daily caloric intake by about 20 to 25% below maintenance. So for example, if your maintenance intake is, say, 3,000 calories per day, a smart deficit to get you going would be around 2,400 calories per day. If you don't have a timeline or date you want to be lean for, or you're looking to retain as much muscle as possible, you could do a 10 to 15% deficit. But in my personal opinion, I like setting fat loss phases up where you go aggressive out the gate when you have more body fat on you, because you're going to be far less fatigued, energy's still high, you have no diet fatigue, etc. So you can afford to push hard out the gate. I like to think about like you're landing a plane. So when a plane's at 30,000 feet, that initial descent from 30,000 to, let's say, like, I don't know, 5 or 10,000, I don't know, I'm not an aviation guy here, but that initial descent, they can go quite hard. Then, as they get closer to the runway, they're not coming in that hot. They're going to start leveling off. And that's exactly how you want to think about your fat loss phase. So from the jump, you can take off as much body fat as possible when you have more body fat on you. So you can look for a higher rate of loss. So this is going to be the amount of weight you're looking to lose each week. So this is ideally at the start around 1 to 1.5% of your body weight, because you can afford that rate of loss. Then what you do is implement what we call a diet break or refeed. So this is where you're going to be kind of helping to reverse those negative adaptations, take the foot off the gas, wash off the diet fatigue that accumulated. So this could look like, depending on your timeline, I mean, you could take a good chunk of fat loss off, let's say 6 to 8 weeks, chill out for, let's say, 4 to 6 weeks, and then go back into a deficit, this time with a slower rate of loss, let's say around 0.5 to 1% of your body weight per week, because as you get leaner, you want to slow it down, okay? And that's a pretty basic approach to fat loss. I wish I knew it from when I started, instead of you hear the whole 500 calorie deficit a day, but that's so, I mean, I'm not going to call it dated, but there are better ways to do it to optimize your fat loss phase, which is why this exactly what this podcast is about. So once your calorie intake is set, the next priority is macronutrient distribution. Protein, we want around at least 1 gram per pound of body weight, or ideal body weight if you're carrying a lot of body fat. So we're still stimulating muscle protein synthesis, we're preventing muscle breakdown, and protein is the most satiating macro, so it's going to keep you fuller longer, making it easier for you to stick to your diet. Next, we structure fats and carbohydrates based on individual needs and training. So fats should make up around 0.3 to 0.4 grams per pound of body weight. You honestly want them as low as you can get them. Beyond, let's say, optimal hormone production and brain function, once you reach a certain set point, additional fats don't really have an additive effect. Versus carbs, if you can get your carbs as high as possible, that will only improve your training performance, your recovery, and help you retain, if not build, muscle throughout your diet. So we want your protein set 1 gram per pound at a minimum, fat set around 0.3, 0.4 grams per pound. Then the remaining calories come from carbohydrates, which serve as the primary fuel source for training performance, which is huge, like I said, and recovery. So carbs in a diet are not the enemy, even though they're made to seem that way. While they are what we will lower first as the diet goes on, we want to keep them as high as we can, and we want to place the majority of our carb intake around our workout, fuel our training first, and replenish glycogen post-training to improve our recovery. So calories and macros are set. Now, meal timing and food quality also play a significant role in optimizing fat loss, because we want, from a meal timing aspect, to be spiking MPS, or muscle protein synthesis, 3 to 5 times throughout the day. So I'd recommend having 4 to 5 meals throughout the day. 4 to 5 is just a good rule in general. 4 to 5 meals, 4 to 5 training sessions, pretty optimal. Then our food quality will tie into gut health, which does, in fact, play a role in how efficiently your body burns body fat. So your gut microbiome, the trillions of bacteria living in your digestive system, directly impacts nutrient absorption, so your ability to actually absorb what you eat, inflammation, and there is a gut to testosterone connection, which is pretty cool. And you could look up gut to any organ axis, and you'll find something like gut liver axis, gut kidney axis, gut brain axis is a big one. So the gut is fascinating, so we do want to be taking care of that with a variety of whole nutrient-dense foods in our diet. And of course, the gut will have an effect on your hunger hormones as well. So if one has, let's say, poor gut health, which can stem from a ton of things like chronic stress, chronic dieting, being a caloric deficit for too long, overconsumption of ultra-processed and processed foods, history of antibiotic use, which will wipe out your bacteria, it can lead to chronic inflammation, it can lead to insulin resistance, and even potentially increased fat storage. So, long story short, energy balance matters. calories in versus calories out is 100% our main driver of fat loss, but optimizing our hormones, gut health, and inflammation are also right up there. They're key to long-term fat loss success and will make the process much more efficient. That's why beyond micronutrients, food selection and digestion are something we want to pay close attention to. And we can do this, like I said, by simply focusing on whole nutrient-dense foods, making sure we don't have any micronutrient deficiencies, which is why I love the app Chronometer. I absolutely no affiliation with them, but if you plug your diet into there, it will not only give you your macros, like MyFitnessPal, but also your micronutrient intake and your electrolyte intake. So it's just basically a better version of MyFitnessPal, in my opinion, because then you can see, okay, let's take a look at my diet. Let's see where my micronutrients are at. Do I need to input any other foods to hit these certain targets, or can I backfill with supplementation to then not have any nutrient deficiencies? And same thing with electrolytes. You can see where your sodium to potassium ratio is, which most humans are deficient in potassium. You want your potassium to sodium ratio at least 1 to 1. So if you're consuming 3,000 milligrams of sodium, you at least want 3,000 milligrams of potassium. Now, most people's, you're a normal person, looks like sodium up here. If you're listening to this, my left hand's like way in the sky, and then potassium way down low. So you want at least 1 to 1, and you can, again, sort that out through Chronometer. Okay, so now that we've set up your fat loss diet, let's talk about how to train for maximum fat loss while most importantly preserving muscle and performance. Many people approach training when their goal is fat loss the wrong way. They either crank up cardio while completely just putting strength training to the side, or they start pushing training volume way too high, leading to muscle loss. The reality is that your training during a fat loss phase should look very similar, if not identical, to how you train in a muscle building phase. There is just a few key adjustments to account for recovery. The first priority is maintaining strength. By far the biggest mistake people make when dieting is dropping intensity and switching to these crazy high rep workouts, or those fat burning workouts, a bunch of supersets. And this is just a terrible mistake, because the best way to maintain muscle while losing fat is to train like how you would train if your goal is to build muscle. When you're in a caloric deficit, your body is constantly looking for ways to conserve energy. And one of the first things it will try to do is get rid of muscle unless you give it a reason to keep it. So a good fat loss training program should look like a good training program in general. 3 to 5 days per week of strength training. Ideally, you're hitting each muscle group twice per week. You keep your rep ranges mostly in the 6 to 12 rep range, because this will prevent unnecessary fatigue. Higher rep work does generate more fatigue. We're getting into the weeds here, but essentially train hard. It also helps you keep your nervous system fresh. Now on isolations, feel free to go higher, but by far the most important thing is that, like I said, you were training hard. So at least within 3 reps in reserve, 3 RIR, and failure. Now, if you're new to the gym, I would just shoot for failure, because the likelihood you're able to actually accurately judge where, let's say, 2 or 3 reps in reserves is quite low. So even myself, I've been training for, I would say properly training for about 3-4 years now, and my ability to judge where 3 reps in reserve is quite low. 1 rep in reserve I can judge, 2 maybe, 3 absolutely not. So just shoot for failure and you should be good. I personally like training 1 to 2 reps in reserve during my fat loss phases, and I did in my most recent one, and I even built muscle throughout it, because the goal is muscle retention. But again, I've been training to failure, complete failure. With my first bodybuilding coach, that's how we trained. We trained balls to the wall till you cannot complete another rep. So I can accurately judge somewhat where 1 to 2 RIR is, which is difficult to do. So broad recommendation, take your sets to the point where the concentric, the pushing portion, or lifting portion starts to involuntarily slow down. Another big mistake is dramatically increasing training volume at the start of a fat loss phase. People, for some reason, assume they need to add more sets, more reps, or potentially more workout days, but this is almost always counterproductive in a fat loss phase. The goal at the start of a fat loss phase is to set a baseline volume that allows you to progress week on week at the start, but is not your maximal recoverable volume. So for most people, this will look like anywhere from 6 to maybe 10 sets per body part, depending on how hard you train and how well you execute your lifts, how accurate you are. You can think of it like playing darts. The better you are at darts, the less darts you have to throw. So if you're someone who's great at resistance training, you got perfect technique, you got perfect form, your ability to train in close proximity to failure is on point, you're going to need less sets than someone who most of their sets look like trash essentially, and they're training nowhere near failure. Now when it comes to cardio, there is a big misconception that more cardio equals more fat loss. And while cardio can be a useful tool, it's a tool. It should be used strategically, not as the primary driver of fat loss. In fact, NEAT, our non-exercise activity thermogenesis, is far more important than structured cardio. One of the best things you can do, the biggest lever to increase your caloric output, is to increase your step count to at least, it should be a bare minimum, honestly, throughout any phase, 8 to 10,000 steps a day. But you can start there at the beginning of your fat loss phase, and then down the line, when you need to create a bigger deficit, you can then increase that. For some people, they will need structured cardio. So if that's you, then we want to go with low intensity, steady state. So incline treadmill, cycling, spin bike, maybe for some the Stairmaster, but that comes with its own cost of fatigue you should be mindful of. So if your leg training starts to take a nosedive, maybe pull back on the Stairmaster. And this can be done 3 to 5 times per week for 15 to 30 minutes. And again, you can use cardio as a tool as the diet goes on to increase the deficit, but I'd save it for the later stages, or potentially, like we spoke about at the beginning of the podcast, that initial first chunk of fat we can pull off. Maybe you have 2-3 cardio sessions in 20 minutes, or even up to 30, potentially 40 minutes at that start. But then as we diet break and then as we get into that second chunk of fat loss, I would pull cardio out completely. Just focus on hitting your step goal and running that up. For example, in my most recent diet, I didn't do cardio the whole time. I lost 35, 40 pounds, came off the back of fixing a bunch of health issues, which is why I got so out of shape in the first place, which not ideal, but we're back now. Essentially, my steps started at the diet. They started 8 to 9K per day. Slowly, as we needed to, increase them. So at the end of the diet, I was doing about 15K per day, and that's the highest they got. So no cardio throughout the whole diet, just use my step count, which, I mean, first time I ever did that, first diet with no cardio, and was a breeze, if I'm being honest. So as the diet goes on, small incremental changes in your step count is what I do, or small additions in cardio, not just adding an hour. I'd start with, let's say, okay, if you're doing 20 minutes 3 times a week, maybe we do 20 minutes 4 times a week, maybe, or 30 minutes 3 times a week. So now that we've covered nutrition and training and cardio, let's talk about one of the most overlooked factors in a fat loss phase, which is your number one performance enhancing tool, natural performance enhancing tool, which is sleep. You can have the perfect diet and training program, but if your sleep is poor and your stress is out of control, your fat loss results will suffer significantly. I've seen this time and time again with clients where they're nailing absolutely everything. They're on point. Check-ins are coming in every week. They're crushing it. Diet is on point. Step count is on point. Training is on point. But sleep is not being prioritized, and we're seeing that being reflected in their training performance and their physique. They're carrying more water, they're more fatigued, and we're not seeing the changes we'd expect. When you don't get enough sleep, a few things happen. First, poor sleep increases ghrelin, which is, the hunger hormone, so it's going to make you crave more food. And at the same time, leptin, the satiety hormone, decreases. So you're craving more food, and then it makes it harder to feel full after meals. So that's one part, but also the cortisol increase, which will cause a whole cascade of effects not conducive to fat loss. Same thing with the nervous system. It will put you in more of a sympathetic dominant state, which is your fight or flight state. Again, not optimal to be in that state the majority of the time to lose body fat. Not to mention how close sleep is linked to your testosterone, as well as cortisol and testosterone having an opposite relationship. So if cortisol is high, chronically, your testosterone will be lower. And sleep and growth hormone, and it is your number one recovery tool. So if you're not recovering from your training, you're at a much higher risk to then lose muscle. So if the goal is fat loss, prioritize sleep just like you'd prioritize your diet and training. And you can do that by doing some pretty basic things. First, keeping a consistent sleep schedule, so you're going to bed and you're waking up at the same time every day. You're doing your best to eliminate blue light exposure from screens at least an hour and a bit before bedtime, or you just invest in some blue light glasses. You're making your room a bat cave, so you're keeping it dark, cool, and quiet. For temperature, around 65 Fahrenheit or 18 degrees is ideal. You're limiting caffeine ideally after 2 p.m. the latest, because some people do metabolize caffeine a little bit differently. And I could go on, but for the sake of this podcast, I'll stop there. If you want more tips on how to optimize your sleep, you can check out a previous podcast I did that solely focuses on that. But the overarching theme is that if you make sleep a priority, you will make fat loss much more efficient and much more sustainable. Now on to the fun part. It's time to talk about supplements that actually work for fat loss. And with that said, No supplement will replace everything we just went through. No supplement will replace a proper diet and training program or somehow replace a caloric deficit, but there are a handful of research-backed supplements that can enhance fat loss when paired with everything we just spoke about. So let's start with L-carnitine. This is one of the most underrated fat loss supplements. L-carnitine is an amino acid that helps the transport of fat into the mitochondria to then be burned for energy. So to break this down, fat loss happens in three main stages. We have mobilization, so the releasing of fat from the fat cell. Then we have transportation, moving that fat into the mitochondria. Then we have oxidation, where that mitochondria burns that fat for energy. L-carnitine specifically supports that second step, so it acts as a taxi, so transporting the released fat into the mitochondria where it then can actually be burned. This is crucial because just mobilizing fat doesn't guarantee it will be burned for energy without proper transport and oxidation. So by improving fat transport, L-carnitine makes your fat loss efforts more efficient. Now, what form of L-carnitine should you use? The bioavailability of oral L-carnitine is quite terrible. Only about 14 to 18% of it's getting absorbed. That means you need to take 3 to 4 grams of oral L-carnitine to match a 500 milligram injectable dose, which has 100% bioavailability. Now, timing with L-carnitine is very important as well. The best time to take L-carnitine is 30 to 60 minutes before fasted cardio or a workout. Now, next we have yohimbine and rowolsine. Two tools you could use for stubborn fat loss. Yohimbine is an alpha-2 adrenergic receptor antagonist, which means it blocks the receptors that prevent fat loss in stubborn areas. So you can, like, your lower back, your hips, and potentially your glutes. And if you remember the three stages of fat loss we literally just went over, yohimbine works at stage 1. So that fat mobilization, helping release stored fat that would otherwise be difficult to lose. But yohimbine only works in a fasted state. When insulin is present in the bloodstream from eating, it blunts yohimbine's effects. So if you're going to take yohimbine or rowolsine, take it fasted and start with a low dose of 2.5 milligrams and then work up from there. But be mindful because it is a strong stimulant that puts your body in a fight or flight mode. So overuse can increase cortisol, then be counterproductive. That's why I like rowolsine, alpha yohimbine, which is often a better choice. It's more of a selective, potent version of yohimbine with a little bit of fewer side effects. Yohimbine, people can find that it causes jitters, anxiety, hypoglycemia in some people, whereas rowolsine is a smoother and much more effective as well at lower dosages. So I personally use 3 milligrams of rowolsine before fasted cardio during my fat loss phases. For me, fasted steps, which is plenty for me. Now, should you use yohimbine or rowolsine for your entire fat loss phase? I personally wouldn't, because until you reach around 10%, fat loss still should be pretty gradual. So these are best saved for the final stages of a diet when you're already lean but need that extra bit of addition at the end. Next up is fish oil, actually, EPA and DHA, which is a great supplement not only for fat loss but overall health. Omega-3 fatty acids help reduce inflammation. They improve insulin sensitivity. They support fat metabolism, and there's a ton of cognitive health benefits as well. And research suggests that consuming 2 to 3 grams of EPA and DHA can enhance fat oxidation and even help with appetite regulation. And then lastly, we have no-brainer caffeine, which has some strong research behind it for fat loss. However, it's important to not overdo, just like all the stimulants. You want to be mindful of your total stimulant intake. Don't want to overdo caffeine because taking too much will and can make it go from aiding fat loss to blunting fat loss because of increased cortisol, potentially poor sleep, or too much overall sympathetic drive. So we now have a complete fat loss supplement stack to complement your nutrition, training, and expenditure. L-carnitine for fat transport, yohimbine or rowolsine for fat mobilization. Creatine honestly should definitely be in there just for its overall ability to help you with your training performance and maintain muscle mass. And then caffeine, then fish oil, which realistically should be a staple year-round for basically absolutely everybody. Even my mom is on it. And that wraps up today's episode on how to optimize your fat loss phase. So we got basically everything covered, from your nutrition and your training, your cardio and your steps, to sleep, stress, and then of course a little bit of icing on the cake with some supplements to help push fat loss in the right direction. So just to recap, we start with our initial calorie deficit. From there, we set our macros. We hit those macros with whole, nutrient-dense foods. We eat ideally 4 to 5 meals per day. We place a good amount of carbs around our training window. We train exactly like we train to build muscle, set our step goal, and ideally save cardio for further down the line. Prioritize our sleep, and if you want to add in the supplements we covered to give you some slight additional fat loss benefit at the end, you now have the tools to do so. And most importantly, remember, fat loss is a strategic process. You can't just slash calories and do hours of cardio and expect great results. It may work for some people, but if you want to be having, let's say, optimal outcomes, won't work. I've been there, done that. Firsthand can tell you, it doesn't end well. So I hope you enjoyed. All my links are below, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.